Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here, Major. Thank you.
So, among the biggest headlines of the book is your contention that President Trump, in the face of street protests in Washington, D.C., but his general alarm about protests related to George Floyd murder across the country, actively contemplated ordering not only the deployment of the U.S. military, but suggesting that the U.S. military could shoot, not necessarily to kill, but nevertheless shoot protesters in Washington, D.C. Walk us through what that was like.
Yeah, well, that's right. And you have to, kind of the events leading up to it. So myself, General Milley, Attorney General Barr, others get called into the Oval Office that morning of June 1st. And we get there, the president is mad, he's angry, very upset at the protests that had been happening in D.C. the previous nights prior, where we did have a good share of violence, right? People were hurt, fires lit, buildings damaged, and he was very upset at what was happening and wanted to get control of the violence. And so in the course of this meeting that goes back and forth, as he gets angrier and angrier, we reach the point where he actually looks to General Milley and says, and asks, right, can't you just shoot them in the legs or something? And I think we were all dumbstruck at that moment, just shocked that he would suggest such a thing, to shoot Americans in the streets of our nation's capital, no less.
And what was the atmosphere in the room at that moment? Because at one level, I have to think you're looking at each other and saying, is he serious or not? How long does it take he is serious? And then how do you walk him back from that?
Well, again, the entire, 20, 25 minutes in the room was just very heated. He was angry, upset, sitting down, standing up, waving his arms around, using, foul language toward the folks assembled. And frankly, when he said that, I didn't even look to my left or right. I just was so focused on him. He was dead serious. I knew it. And I could feel that all of us were a little bit quite taken aback by it. So, and at that point, you start asking yourself, what's going to happen here? My sense is we are now at a different point here in the discussion, particularly after, he uses profanity directed at Vice President Mike Pence, that we have to figure out a way forward before we get a direct order from the president to deploy combat troops to the nation's city.
Right. And so you have to begin to talk him back from that ledge. How did that go?
Well, when I get the sense that we had reached this new moment, right, this new plateau, and that we were almost on the verge of getting that order, I decided to put on the table, complimenting Bill Barr. Attorney General Barr proposed to put 5,000 law enforcement officers in the city that night. I said that I would immediately start moving National Guard in order to enforce, to support Attorney General Barr, because of course that is the role of the National Guard, is to support civilian law enforcement. And then I said what I thought would get him off this notion of deploying active duty troops into the streets was that I would alert elements of the 82nd Airborne and bring them up to places outside of the city. And I would also alert the Old Guard, which was also outside the city. And I thought that would be enough for him to accept it and move forward and not direct the deployment of troops into the city. And it worked. And, my proposal hung in the air for a while, quite heavily. You could see that he was still upset. But at the end of the day, he conceded and also directed that Bill Barr, rather than the military, would be in charge of this. And that was the exact right answer. Again, this was a law enforcement matter, not a military matter.
Mr. Secretary, you're not alone in experiencing a situation with former President Trump in which he's angry, he's agitated, he's lashing out, and he gives orders that are either ones you can't carry out, ones that have deep legal questions surrounding them, or if they don't have those first two, break through all sorts of established norms in our country that we've never broken through before. And then there has to be kind of a, and I'll use this word, I'm not suggesting it's necessarily your word, intervention among those around the president to pull him in a less aggressive direction. You're not the first cabinet secretary who's had to live the experience you just described. How difficult does that make your job? And what does that say about his, meaning former President Trump's, orientation to the task of the presidency?
Well, on one hand, we were fortunate because he rarely gave orders. He would rant and he would muse and he would suggest and he would press, but rarely gave orders. And so, clearly he was waiting for somebody to bite. and for a consensus, if you will, to form and for people to rush in behind him, which is what always concerned me about leaving the job too soon, is that I was quite confident that I would be replaced by a real loyalist who would go along with these ideas. And that really concerned me. And so, often my tack was to listen, to understand what he was trying to say, and to really push back where I needed to, or to tell him, look, I'll come back in lesser cases. I'll come back with other ideas to help us figure out the way forward to do the right thing. And so it depended on the issue at the time, who was in the room with you, and how I thought best that I could get to a better answer, if you will, in these variety of situations that were out there.
And in your answer just now, you might have begun to explain something that has been said about you critically about this book. Oh, wait a minute, you're telling us 2 years after the fact that the president wanted to shoot Americans in the nation's capital? And there are those who remember you appearing before Congress and getting questions on the House side about what the president's conversations were and what the demeanor was in those moments, and you didn't tell them. Why did you wait 2 years?
Well, first of all, I didn't wait 2 years. First, I actually began writing this book a month after I left office and completed it within 4 months or 5 months. And then it had to work its way through the DOD clearance process, which took 8, 9, 10 months. And eventually I had to, frankly, sue DOD to get the book released. But going back before then, which is the other half of this coin, look, I knew going back earlier than June 1st, right, as these issues would come up, that if I spoke up at the time, I would be fired. And my concern was, if I was fired, there would be somebody else put in my place who would most likely, or more likely, be willing to do some of these things, whether it was shooting missiles into Mexico or conducting some type of strike on Venezuela. My view was that I was in a better position where I was to kind of reshape things, to kind of play defense against dumb ideas, than to go out, speak publicly, have my one shot, my one moment, if you will, and then leave the scene. And look, Major, that would have been far easier for me, for my family to kind of do that. It would have taken a lot of stress off my back. But I thought the better thing for the country was for me to stay and do what I thought was necessary. And look, I didn't just take the counsel of myself and my wife, but I talked to what we call the graybeards in both parties. I mentioned Colin Powell, but my predecessors, Bob Gates, Leon Panetta, all of whom recommended I stay and hang in there, fight the good fight, and do what I could to keep the nation on the rails in some ways, or at least the institution. And so, I struggled with this. I write about in the book. It was a dilemma for me. But at the end of the day, and even today, despite the criticism, I feel it was the right thing to do, to stay.
And I want to let you add one more thought to that, because I've had this conversation with many people who have served in your position, not exactly Defense Secretary, but others who were in the cabinet or served in high positions in the Trump administration, and this ongoing struggle to do what you just described. But on the outside, all they get labeled with is you're complicit. You are aiding and abetting this thing. And I just heard you, and I want to give you one more chance to say it's not complicity, it's management.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Again, at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself what is most important. And for me, it was my oath of office to the Constitution. It's why the book is titled A Sacred Oath, is I felt my duty was to the country. And again, it would have been far easier for me, far less nerve-wracking to just kind of go out, make my speech, get fired, and walk away. But I didn't think that was the best thing for the country. So I didn't see it as complicity at all. I thought, I still think it was doing the right thing. And look, many of us struggle with this. It's the tough thing to do. And I would say to many of those people too, look, if good people don't serve, or if you want the good people to leave the cabinet, then who are you left with? I mean, by definition, you're only left with the bad people. And that's not good for our country. At the end of the day, you serve your country. You don't serve the president or a party or a philosophy. You serve the country, and you have to put that at the top. And that's kind of what I weighed out. And this is a big reason why I wrote the book, for people not just to understand my perspective and how I thought through this and how it weighed on me, but to try and give other people, future secretaries of defense or political appointees, a little bit of a roadmap in case they face the same situation in the future.
So, Mr. Secretary, I covered the Trump campaign from August 2015 all the way through in the first 3 years of the administration. I learned then, and I knew before, that immigration was an important issue, but I didn't understand how powerful an issue it was, how powerfully this candidate, then president, cared about it. And I will tell you, when some people hear that the president suggested to you deploying 250,000 U.S. military forces to the southern border, or even sending missiles into Mexico, they would say, I'm okay with that. I'm fed up with the way things are. I don't feel my country is sovereign, and I want somebody big and bad on that wall, metaphorically. And they thought that was President Trump. Your thoughts on that overall feeling among some Americans about the question of immigration? We'll get to the details in a second.
Oh, look, I think this is a core issue that needs to be explored. And I say this as a Republican, as a conservative, as a Reagan Republican. These are two very important issues, right? How to deal with drugs and how to deal with illegal immigration. And I'll just say two things. I give President Trump credit for being so serious as he was about addressing drugs in America. It affects every community and too many families. And so I was sympathetic to his desire to shoot missiles into Mexico and take out drug labs, but you don't start a war to do that. That's not how you treat your southern neighbor. There are other ways to go about it, and that's what I tried to propose. The second issue, illegal immigration. Look, I support building a barrier on the southwest border, a wall. I think it's very important. You're not a sovereign country if you can't control your borders, if you don't know who's coming in and out. And so I supported that. It was the military that helped build the border. But again, the solution isn't to send 250,000 troops to the border. The solution is to beef up DHS, to hire more border agents, to give them the tools, the authorities they need to do the job. Because look, what's happening on the border right now is horrendous. And the fact is, Congress needs to act and to pass new immigration laws. So I get this. This is the nuance that I try to bring out in this book of how do you manage these issues? Because it's not all black and white when you step back and look at these things.
What would have been the implications of firing even one missile into Mexico to target one drug lab?
Well, look, it was illegal, would have been illegal. It would have been an act of war. It would have undermined our credibility with our allies and partners around the globe. They would have asked themselves, are we next, right? And I just don't think that's a long-term solution to the drug problem. So we take out one lab, another one's going to pop up somewhere else, right? It may make us feel good, or some people feel good, but we need a long-term solution that addresses both supply and demand in this country. And again, I think part of this too is making sure that you can control your southern border, because so much of these illegal drugs are coming across the border in the first place.
I'm glad you mentioned the demand side. People sort of dropped that out of the equation. There wouldn't be supply if there wasn't willing, large demand in the United States.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
Why not send military forces to the border in whatever number? I know 250,000 is a jaw-dropping number, but again, some Americans would say, hey, why not?
Well, we did. I did.
Right.
The current administration is doing it. We have anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 troops at the border supporting the Customs and Border Protection. And so we should do those things. But again, the long-term solution, because I believe in maintaining our military readiness, is to beef up the Department of Homeland Security, give them the tools, the officers, the resources they need to secure that border. It's vitally important, and it should not be a military mission. But in the meantime, I felt it was important to do that, so I did support sending troops to the border. I just don't have 250,000 troops to send, and you don't need 250,000 troops to secure that border. Look, President Trump secured the border during his tenure. He did it. He did it with fewer than 250,000 troops. And so this is a big issue that I think needs to be resolved. And I don't see the current administration really taking it on with the sense of urgency the last one did.
Shifting our attention to Ukraine, is there anything that you think the current Defense Secretary should say but isn't, or advice he should give to President Biden that he isn't?
Well, I'll go back to what I've been saying since day one. I think we should levy the full range of sanctions against Russia. And I'm glad to see that we're finally getting to that point. It seems the EU is now pursuing sanctions on oil, and next should be gas. But I think we should be providing all the material and support they want. I don't know why we hesitated on providing MiG-29s. We should provide not just javelins and stingers, but I think we should be providing anti-ship missiles. That would very much help them control the Black Sea. And so we should also be providing training for the Ukrainians. That was critical. I traveled to Lviv in early 2018 as Army Secretary and watched the training on the ground of Ukrainians, and it made a difference, and it's making a difference today. And we should continue all those things. And look, this is not just a fight between Russia and Ukraine. This is a fight between Russia and the West, and it's a fight between autocracy and democracy. And we need to do everything we can to bolster the Ukrainians. They are fighting the fight that we prepared for and never hoped to do. And so we need to give them all the support we can so that they can win this war.
Quite naturally, as Defense Secretary, you had conversations about the abilities, the capabilities of the Russian military. What in the last 2.5 months have you seen that surprised you as compared to what you were briefed to expect?
Yeah, look, I think there were two surprises. First, we were surprised that they're not as good as we thought. And we were equally surprised that the Ukrainians were far better than we expected. And so this difference between the two, and the fact that the Ukrainians are exhibiting so much courage and grit is making all the difference. That's why Ukraine is winning. And I think these are important lessons that I'm sure the Pentagon is studying today and trying to assess really how good Russia really is.
General alarm about protests related to George Floyd murder across the country actively contemplated ordering not only the deployment of the U.S. military, but suggesting that the U.S. military could shoot, not necessarily to kill, but nevertheless shoot protesters in Washington, D.C. Walk us through what that was like.
Yeah, well, that's right. And you have to, kind of the events leading up to it. So myself, General Milley, Attorney General Barr, others get called into the Oval Office that morning of June 1st. And we get there, the president is mad, he's angry, very upset at the protests that had been happening in DC the previous nights prior, where we did have a good share of violence, right? People were hurt, fires lit, buildings damaged, and he was very upset at what was happening and wanted to get control of the violence. And so in the course of this meeting that goes back and forth, as he gets angrier and angrier, we reach the point where he says, he actually looks to an asymmetrical fight than a head-on clash with the Chinese. There are a number of things they could do right now that they need to lean into.
Back to Ukraine. As Defense Secretary, you had to have conversations with some regularity about Russian capabilities, not only on the ground, but capabilities in the chemical, biological sphere and battlefield nuclear sphere. They have those capabilities. It is part of their doctrine. Unlike ours, it's not part of our doctrine, but it is part of theirs. Do you still believe that is something that could happen if Russia feels it has no other choice?
Look, anything is possible. That's why I said from day one, we should never take the military option off the table. And I criticize President Biden for doing that. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's something we need to be concerned about and watch very, very closely, because that would change the dynamic of the fight and probably how we and NATO would react. So
the Brits have said this war could go on for 10 or 15 years. There's been a change in the mindset here in Washington in the last 6 weeks. Whoa, the Ukrainians are holding on. No, wait, they might be able to win. And now might is slightly shifting to may win, like the probabilities appear to be moving in the Ukrainian direction. Do you agree with that? Do you believe it should be the stated U.S. policy that Ukraine win? And because you're here and we're talking, I'm going to give you the chance to find what victory looks like.
Well, yes. First, I think they are winning on the battlefield. I think they're defending their country, their homeland, their people, their families. And so I think they have every motivation to win. And I think we should support that. Again, they're fighting the fight that we don't have to, and we should give them all the support we can to do that. And I think Secretary Austin, in a moment of candor, said, look, our aim should be to weaken Russia, to take it off the stage so it's no longer a great power when it comes to military might. And so I think that's critical. With regard to how this ends or where it goes, I think we should stand firmly behind President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. He should tell us what he wants and where he's going. And to me, what does victory look like? Victory looks like Ukraine prior to the invasion in 2014. In other words, it once again is a sovereign state. There's no Russian forces in the Donbass, and there's no Russian forces in Crimea, and there's no Russian forces anywhere in Ukraine. And Kyiv is free to choose to be in whatever organization they want. Certainly the EU, and if they want to join NATO, they should pursue that process as well and pursue NATO membership. To me, that's what victory looks like. That's what I would like to see as the outcome.
And probably enforced or at least maintained by a peacekeeping force, I suspect, don't you?
If need be, if that's what it takes, it makes sense to do it under a UN umbrella. And if UN is unable to act because of China's or Russia's role in the Security Council, then we could do it as NATO, or we could do it as a collection of European and the United States and other allies who are willing to put troops on the ground to enforce the peace.
And America should be willing to do that.
Absolutely. Look, again, we're defending a democracy. This is about the world order in the year 2022, and what does the 21st century look like? And it's not just Russia, it's China really is the bigger strategic threat, biggest strategic adversary lurking behind them. And we have to stand up today for democracy. If we don't, the Chinese will misread that and think that we're unwilling to fight for those values that have really produced such freedoms and economic prosperity for millions around the world.
Your book thinks about and talks about the state of American institutions and state of American democracy. Where do you think we are?
I think the biggest threat facing our country is extreme political partisanship, which is resulting in dysfunction in DC, and we have to solve that problem. We got to get people working together. They have to be taking less extreme positions, because the only way we move forward in this very challenging century is if our political leaders are working together for the nation's good. And that's everything from addressing, a budget that's out of control, to military spending, to looking at other issues that the country faces and getting aligned so we can deal with the likes of China.
And I imagine that is something you see on both sides of the political aisle, this extremism.
Oh, absolutely. Look, and what's interesting about this point in time, and I'm somebody who worked in DC for 25 years, you see both parties are fighting amongst themselves, right? Progressives versus moderates within the Democrat Party. And, you have these extreme partisans, the Trump crowd versus moderates, if you will, or traditional conservatives in the Republican Party. And so we need to pay less attention to the wings on these parties and more focus on the folks in the middle, whether it's, Democrat or Republican, and find ways to work together to advance the nation's interests.
And you well know, Mr. Secretary, that the former president only wants to talk about Trump Republicans, not quote unquote rhinos, which you, of course, have just most recently been labeled as by him.
Look, I've been a lifelong Republican. I've worked for great Republicans when I was on Capitol Hill. I'm far more of a Republican than Donald Trump is. And look, the issue the Republican Party has to figure out is this. Donald Trump, to his credit, advanced a traditional Republican agenda: lower taxes, less regulation, beefing up the military, conservative judges, all those things that Republicans love. What they need to understand, though, despite successes Trump had in those areas, we could do a lot better with a leader who is less divisive, who can grow the base, and who has kind of some core principles and integrity about him that can really help us advance, a traditional Republican conservative agenda. Again, I call myself a Reagan Republican. That's where my heart is, my head is. That's what we need to get back to.
Mr. Secretary, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.